Warning: the following video contains content that may be disturbing for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey guys, I'm Panashblack and once again welcome to my little crime channel in the heart of Wales. Today we are discussing the case of Paul, Dawn and Samantha Ralph. So with all that said, let's begin. In the year 1973, a 20-year-old man was said to have murdered and mutilated his friend's 3 young children. Now no apparent motive has ever been established and he has never expressed any type of regret. Now, 45 plus years after being jailed, David Mcgreevy is free to walk the streets once again. It was said to be a crime that would destroy a family, horrify the nation and, with its gruesome details, continue to provoke a furious reaction in Worcester. Yet it has surprisingly managed to largely stay below the radar of the British public. Now before we continue guys, we need to give everyone a brief warning. As sadly this video will contain content that includes descriptions that some readers might find distressing as it refers to children. David Anthony Mcgreevy was born in Southport in 1951 to Bella and Thomas Mcgreevy. David was the second eldest of 6 children. As David's father was a sergeant in the Royal Signals, a lot of his childhood was spent moving from one army base to another. This could mean that one year he was being educated in an army school in England, the next, in Germany. But according to Mcgreevy's mother, living in Germany was his happiest time. The children picnicked and biked in the woods and even went skiing. David Mcgreevy's mother, Bella, later said she could only remember one childhood incident of concern. The family were living in Cardiff, and David had stole his mother's shopping money in order to take a trip to Liverpool. From an early age this definitely shows signs that a young David Mcgreevy showed evidence of impulsivity. In 1967, 15-year-old David Mcgreevy left school and enlisted in the Royal Navy. It was always Mcgreevy's lifelong ambition. His father doubted his dedication, but Mcgreevy was said to be absolutely determined. By the late 60s Mcgreevy was stationed at Portsmouth Naval Base. He joined his first ship, which was the HMS Eagle. If you talk to his colleagues from his Navy days, they will tell you that he was rather an arrogant young man. He always had to have the last word. He had quite a cocky attitude. And that did end up getting him into trouble quite a lot in the Navy. Which then led him into being subject to quite a few disciplinary procedures. The turning point in David Mcgreevy's naval career occurred at the RNAS Brodie in Pembrokeshire. David worked as a steward in the mess hall. He saw his name written in a chief petty officer's book. He thought this indicated a change of job. In a pattern that would repeat itself with fatal consequences, he stopped thinking, and started drinking. Others noted that when he turned up for his watch, he was agitated, and drunk. In a moment of madness, he did something that marked the beginning of the end of his short-lived naval career. He actually broke into an officer's wardroom, and set fire to a bin that had papers in it. He said he did this mistakenly, by accidentally dropping a cigarette end, and he did raise the alarm at 2:30 in the morning. He expected the Navy to believe that he was just an innocent eyewitness. They saw beyond that. He was court-martialed. David wasn't found guilty of arson, but of negligence. He was sentenced to 90 days detention. He also underwent psychiatric testing. His commanding officer never revealed the results and his parents were given no explanation for his bizarre behavior. To this day, that psychiatric report isn't available for public inspection. But the attempted arson indicated an impulsive individual unable to envisage the consequences of his actions. The boy who had stolen his mother's money and the man who had tried arson for revenge were one and the same. The only difference was now David had started to drink, and alcohol affected him greatly. In 1971, David Mcgreevy was shore-based at Portsmouth Dockyard after a tour of the Far East on the HMS Eagle. He started a relationship with a woman called Mary. From January to April they exchanged 2 letters a week. David's letters became longer and longer. Eventually in April 1971 he meets Mary for the very first time. And 1 week later at a social event in Birmingham he proposes to her. He hasn't actually really known this girl at all, but within 1 week of meeting her he's proposing marriage. After the engagement, David saw Mary for 2 long weekends in June and July. After, his letter writing increased in length and intensity. But David's mother disapproved of her son's relationship. Mary suffered from quite significant health problems. She had some issues with her spine and she was often in quite a lot of discomfort. If this condition wasn't treated, it could one day lead to her being paralyzed. But David's mother thought that Mary was a bit of a hypochondriac, that she was exaggerating. But David was absolutely besotted with Mary, so his mother's words went unheeded. David always thought he knew best and wouldn't listen to either parent. By August 1971 David's naval career was over. He was dismissed. He turned up at his parents' house one day looking very defeated, dropped his bags on the floor, and said, "I'm out." The end of his childhood dreams devastated David. David went from job to job. He worked as a chef and as a laborer. He was sacked from both. His attitude, arrogance and affection for alcohol were often to blame. With nothing else in his life, David focused on the one good thing in his life, his fiancée, Mary. He planned to marry her during the Christmas period of 1971. Despite being jobless and broke, he started to fantasize about having a big, traditional, and therefore expensive, wedding. Mary would have settled for something less, she would have settled for a registry office ceremony. But David was quite determined that they were going to have this big church wedding, and I think it all became quite real at this point. This young man who wants to marry Mary, who's obsessed with having this big wedding, and she actually called it off on New Year's Eve of 1971. By January 1972, David was living with his parents in the Midlands. He'd been discharged from the Royal Navy, and his fiancée had left him. The 20-year-old David had no work, and no money. But instead of being grateful for the roof over his head, he sat a day and sulked. He's effectively doing nothing in his parents' house. He won't do any household chores. Obviously, he can't contribute to the rent. He's not really looking for work. Eventually his parents throw him out of the house. David moved in with an old school friend, Clive Ralph. Clive lived with his pregnant wife Elsie. The couple already had 2 children. 3-year-old Paul and 20-month-old Dawn, and they lived not far from where David's parents lived. The area was fast changing but still retained the sense of community with which Elsie had grown up, she was said to say. We lived in a cul-de-sac, there was about 10 houses in this cul-de-sac and there was children in every houses, and it was one of those places where everybody left the door open for anybody to come in and out, and everybody looked after everybody. Dorothy Elsie Clay had married Clive Ralph, 5 years her senior, in September 1968 when she was just 16. Pregnant with her first child, Paul, it wasn't long before the second child, Dawn, arrived in 1971. Clive worked hard to provide for his growing family. Elsie had mentioned, he worked for his father, lorry driving. David Mcgreevy came to live with us because he had had an argument with his parents or something. And that's how it all started. David's arrival meant that when in September 1972, Elsie gave birth to Samantha, there were 6 people living in just one, small, 2-bedroom house. She went on to explain that David shared the bedroom with Paul. Samantha was only little, so she was still in a little cradle cot. And then Dawn had another bed with us. As the time was going on we were going to look for a bigger place anyway, but it didn't get to that part. With Clive regularly away for work, David would act as an extra pair of hands, helping out with childcare. He paid £6 a week towards the rent and even cooked the occasional meal on a Sunday. Neighbors remember him as a bit of a know-it-all, but otherwise, harmless. This, however, all changed when David drank. He was well known in the local police station and they pulled him in once. Or twice. The classic case was, he's walking down one of the main streets in the middle of the road, walking the white lines, to prove he wasn't drunk. It upset his dad, because his dad lived not far away. And he told him to keep off the booze. But David didn't listen. And even though David's father Tom Mcgreevy is said to have quoted, everyone who knew David knew that he loved children. In a moment of drunken madness, he would forever shame his family, and destroy another. On the 13th of April 1973, David begins drinking. He plays darts and cards with a friend in a Vauxhall pub. They have between 5 and 7 pints. The session ends badly when David puts his cigarette out in his friend's drink. That ends up with a small altercation between them both. Clive then arrives to take him home. David looks after Clive and Elsie's children when Clive takes Elsie to and from her bar work. She works just 2 miles away at the Punch Bowl in Ronkswood. When she leaves that night, she has no way of knowing that she will never ever see her children alive again. Before the horrendous event, neither Clive nor Elsie thought they had any reason to be concerned over leaving the 21-year-old lodger in charge of their 3 children. David was said to be very good with them and they'd had many happy playtimes together. He'd often bounce Dawn and Samantha on his knees for hours at a time to amuse them. Elsie had said that he seemed just like a normal person really. He used to play with the children, with the elder 2, torment them and play with them and things like that, just like any normal person would. Clive had been known to like to pop in for last orders at Elsie's work and have a quick pint as she finished up. So by the time he leaves home all the kids had been tucked up in bed. At some point between 10:15 p.m. and 11:15 p.m., David, still worse for wear for drink, loses his temper. Samantha, just 9 months old, won't stop crying. So instead of trying to soothe her, or maybe trying to work out what the problem may be with baby Samantha, David Mcgreevy instead puts his hand over baby Samantha's mouth. Then he decides to strangle her. When she eventually stops breathing, he goes into the bathroom. He then takes a razor and uses it on her. He then inflicts a compound fracture on her skull. He then goes and strangles Dawn, and cuts her throat with a razor. He goes on to strangle Paul with some curtain wire. Mcgreevy then mutilates the bodies. Mcgreevy goes into the basement. He finds a pickaxe and with the pickaxe handle, he mutilates the bodies of the children even further. And yet that's not the end. He then decides to put the bodies of the 3 children on the railings outside of the house. Now can you imagine that scene? Can you just think of the psychology of a person behaving in that way? This is not someone who is ashamed of what he has done. He's showing everybody what he has done. He's not trying to conceal the bodies by burying them. He is putting the bodies up for display. Mcgreevy leaves their impaled bodies on the iron-spiked railings of the next-door neighbor's house. He leaves, just walks away, then the police arrive. They cordon off the area. At first they can't locate the children's bodies. They then find them. The 3 siblings are in a row, impaled. Most people like myself ask the question, how can people kill small children? And, the thing that you've got to remember is that the most powerful person in any household is the child. But it's also the physically weakest. It is the most powerful person in the household because it is the child's timetable that dictates how that house will operate. The child wakes up, it has to be fed, the child has to have a nappy changed. And so it's the child's timetable that dominates how the adults have to behave. And some adults cannot cope with that responsibility. And it's when the adult who cannot cope with that responsibility is placed in a position of power over a physically weaker human being that sometimes disastrous results happen. Police at the scene were said to be left sick and shaken. One experienced officer was said to have vomited. When Clive and Elsie tried to go home, the police stopped them. They wouldn't let them back into their home. They took the parents to the police station. At first, the police couldn't rule the parents out as murder suspects. When the police realized Elsie and Clive weren't responsible, they had the task of telling them their children had been murdered. Elsie was just 23 years old when she was told her world, as she knew it, was over. It was too much, she explained. This is when they'd told us that there had been a murder, that there was an investigation going on, and that's as far as I can really remember properly because there was a doctor there at the time because I went hysterical. Which you would, and he gave me an injection, and I don't really. I never ever went back to the house. I wasn't allowed because I was screaming saying that I wanted to go and see my children and they said we couldn't do that. I wasn't allowed to go to the mortuary. The police turned their attentions to the only missing member of the household, David McGreevy. It didn't take the police long to locate him. At 10 to 4 in the morning, PC Elliott found McGreevy in nearby Lansdowne Road. He was immediately arrested and apparently said, "What's this all about?" At first, he was said to have denied it, but then, several hours after his arrest, he said, "It was me, but it wasn't me," and then went on to describe, in quite graphic, but measured detail, what he'd done, but couldn't really explain why he'd done it. Everyone searched for a motive. It was suggested by one of the psychiatrists that there may have been a sexual motive behind this, but there was no question of him having sexually abused the children, either before that night, or during these terrible events. One of the first reporters on the scene was Tony Bishop, who had been called by the editor of the Worcester News in the early hours on Saturday the 14th of April. Memories from that morning still haunt him. He went on to say, "We saw these horrible railings, and the blood was congealed on 'em railings. 3 children had been suddenly murdered and mutilated on a sleepy suburban street. But inquiries revealed that few neighbors had heard or seen anything suspect. A couple of guests of nearby neighbors did try and investigate, but seeing nothing, they returned home. It was hoped the trial would somehow bring some answers and sense to the senseless killing spree. I just can't get my head around this. He senselessly butchers 3 small children, mutilates their bodies, and nobody, and I mean nobody, not one soul sees or is said to have heard anything." This was supposedly carried out in a drunken rage. You'd expect the method to be the same for each of them. But the fact that he used different methods suggests that he had time in between each of the killings to consider what he was going to do next. And that implies some kind of premeditation. In this case, on Monday the 16th of April 1973, David McGreevy made a 10-minute appearance at Worcester Magistrates Court. He was charged with the murders of the 3 Ralph children. The public gallery was packed with people, many of them women. This was most unusual for a court hearing at that time. There were women with prams outside the court, and just thinking about it, I bet if they could have got at him, they would have lynched him. David McGreevy appeared in court 10 times for remand hearings. He was granted legal aid. On Thursday, June 28, 1973, 9 weeks after the killings, he appeared at Worcester Magistrates Court. For the ones who do not have any knowledge of what legal aid is, legal aid can help meet the costs of legal advice, family mediation and representation in a court or tribunal. But you'll usually need to show that your case is eligible for legal aid. The problem is serious. You cannot afford to pay for legal costs. You could, for example, get legal aid if you've been accused of a crime, face prison. You'll usually need to show that you cannot afford to pay for this help. He apparently had looked very down. He looked at the public gallery occasionally. He was obviously resigned to his fate. There was probably a definite atmosphere in there. The police were said to have been pretty anxious at the time and that he wasn't in court for too long. They shepherded him out quickly. They didn't bring him in till the last minute, till the magistrates were ready, and they took him out straight away. Some of the injuries McGreevy had inflicted were so horrific, the prosecution didn't detail them. But with no defense plea, no motive, and with not even a plea of diminished responsibility. The hearing lasted just 8 minutes. In some ways, it was quite surreal, because a murder of this horrific nature was one where you might have expected a lengthy hearing. You might have expected a lot of material to come out in the cross-examination of the accused. But, of course, because he pleaded guilty, it was over pretty quickly. And it was a slightly anticlimactic hearing in one respect. You didn't have the high drama of denials that you'd come across. For example, in the Moores murder case, it's not edged on the national psyche in the way that Brady and Hindley are. On Monday, the 30th of July 1973, David McGreevy was sentenced for the murders of Paul, Dawn and Samantha Ralph. In the same year that McGreevy killed, he was tried, sentenced and sent down. Mr. Justice Simon, the High Court judge, had said they were exceptionally horrific crimes. He said McGreevy should serve at least 20 years before release was even considered. The only reason McGreevy offered for the killing was that Samantha was crying for her bottle. So sickeningly sadistic and senseless were the crimes that many expected him to die behind bars. Elsie, the mother of Samantha, Dawn and Paul, took an overdose 6 months after their murders. She had said, "I tried to commit suicide, I was on such a high dosage of sedation from the doctors to try and get me through this thing. My husband come to me one day and he just said he couldn't cope with it anymore and he was putting in for a divorce." In prison, McGreevy becomes one of the country's most notorious and long-serving prisoners. At one time he challenged Ian Brady, the Moors murderer, to a fight to prove that he was the most notorious of the pair. In prison, the molesters and murderers of children are often persecuted and frequently physically attacked. David McGreevy was no exception. McGreevy's time in prison has been very much up and down, and that's hinged on the extent to which his fellow prisoners are aware of the crimes that he's carried out. When they have been aware of them, he's had a rather unpleasant time, being subject to everything from mild threats of violence to full-on serious physical assaults. This has led to him spending much of his time in segregation, or in vulnerable prisoners' units. In 1975 he is seriously assaulted by fellow prisoners. 3 years later he is threatened with violence. In 1991 his cell is fouled by other inmates. Just 4 days later he goes into closed conditions. In 1994 he is transferred to Category D open conditions. But his transfer to Leyhill Prison in South Gloucestershire broke down after press reports meant prisoners learnt of his past crimes. In 1995 several prisoners try to attack him in an open prison. They're prevented. For the ones who do not have any knowledge of the UK prison systems, here's a brief description of them. The UK prison system is currently divided into 4 categories, ranging from A to D. Establishments in categories A, B or C are closed prisons. Inmates in these types of prisons are regarded as not trusted to try to escape, and are not permitted to leave the prison grounds. Category D prisons operate very differently. They're often referred to as open prisons, and inmates are permitted to leave the premises after official approval at certain times. This process is called ROTL, release on temporary license, and inmates may be allowed to leave to work within the community or return home for a limited period of time. In 1996 McGreevy is again the victim of a serious assault. In 2006 McGreevy, now 54, prepared for parole. He stayed in a bail hostel in Liverpool. It transpired that he had been allowed to walk around Liverpool unsupervised in preparation for his release from Ford Prison in Arundel, West Sussex. Local papers started publishing his photo. It showed his long locks of hair were long gone. The balding, bespectacled face that stared down the camera lens now looked haunted. McGreevy once again became headline news. He was sent back to prison. An interesting theme in the post-Leveson era, someone in the prison service or the police service, or the Home Office, had tipped off the press about this, who photographed McGreevy wandering the streets in Liverpool. The Home Office said it was normal procedure to let lifers out temporarily. The idea of his release galvanized the local community. The then MP for Worcester, Mike Foster, called for McGreevy to be barred from ever returning to the city. Elsie had said, "These were indescribable acts of brutality that still sicken. My gut instinct is that this man should spend the rest of his life in prison." They'd seen him in an internet cafe, and when I got to hear that I went straight to Sir George Young the MP and spoke to him about it, and I said to him, "They're supposed to keep me informed of any movement like that of him." In April 2007, McGreevy's latest bid for parole was refused. Elsie was still in disbelief he was even allowed to apply for freedom. Elsie had said, "This man took 3 children's lives. He should have got the electric chair. If he was released, I'd be waiting outside with a gun." Then the parole board recommended McGreevy for open conditions. Not everyone agreed. In 2009, McGreevy underwent his 7th review hearing. His legal team challenged the then Secretary of State's refusal to recommend the client be transferred to open prison. McGreevy was told he must remain under closed prison conditions, but the judge imposed a ban on naming McGreevy to protect him from other prisoners. He could only be referred to as Prisoner M. McGreevy, therefore, joined a notorious set of human beings. Such anonymity is more usually applied to released prisoners such as the murderers of toddler James Bulger. And people like Maxine Carr, the former partner of Ian Huntley who killed Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, have been granted lifelong anonymity. David McGreevy's legal team had used 4 sections of the Human Rights Act to keep his identity secret. Article 2 – the right to life. Article 3 – the right to protection from ill treatment. Article 5 – the right to liberty and security. Article 8 – the right to privacy and a family life. Quincy Whitaker, McGreevy's lawyer, insisted that if fellow prison inmates learned of his identity through the media, there was a serious likelihood of a serious attack. For some, such an attack would be justice. My heart goes out to Clive and Elsie. It ripped at my heart to see that she had said, "He doesn't deserve human rights, he's not even human."
It would break my heart because I've been fighting for the last 10 years or so to keep him where he is, because for what he did to my children. They say 20 years for life, but he took 3 lives, and I feel that he should never ever be released.
Can you explain at all, Dorothy, what he's done to your family and what he continues to do to your family?
Well, he broke up my marriage to start off with. I was never allowed to go back into the property that I lived in with the children because of what happened. I had to move away from the area because of the people, you know, the looks I would get from people, plus the thoughts I had in my own head that it was my fault because I left the children and went to work that night. And it's just heartbreaking, and I have a job to go back up there to the children's grave even.
In January 2013, McGreevy applied to be transferred to an open prison and was refused. With his anonymity in place, the press were unable to report this. This order lasted for 4 years. It was challenged in 2013 by a group of media organizations, and the Secretary of State as well, who said, "We have principles of open justice." By 2013, McGreevy had been in jail for 40 years, twice his original sentence. On the 22nd of May, his anonymity order was lifted. As soon as fellow prisoners knew his identity, his cell was trashed and his bed was urinated on. Human excrement was smeared on his walls. McGreevy after that lived in closed conditions in a vulnerable prisoners unit. He didn't know why he committed those murders, and so, for me, my feelings towards McGreevy are, this is a man who would still pose a risk to other children should he be released back into the community. We know of no reason why he behaved in this way, and because we know of no reason as to why he behaved in that way, it would be impossible to treat him, to change his behavior. I don't know if he's expressed remorse, I don't know if he now realizes the gravity of the offenses that he committed. I wouldn't want to be part of the process that ever took the risk of 3 other children dying. In failing to explain his motives for his actions publicly, and in trying to remain anonymous, McGreevy had probably ensured he would indeed die in jail. However, there may come a time when some believe he has served his time. And then, like other notorious child killers like John Venables and Robert Thompson, McGreevy will be given anonymity. We may never know what happens next and what the future holds for the monster of Worcester, David McGreevy. But what we do know, he is out walking the streets as we speak. Please like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Also hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our future content. Guys, it's been a pleasure once again. I am Panashblack, and thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care.